We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I'm happy to be joined once again by my colleague, Kylee Zempel, assistant editor at The Federalist. Kylee, welcome back.
Thanks, Emily.
So today we're going to talk about Demi Lovato's transition from identifying as a woman to identifying as gender non-binary and using the they, them, their pronouns. So this may seem like something that is a Hollywood triviality. It may seem like just sort of radical leftism run amok in the Hollywood bubble, but there are actually serious implications to Demi Lovato's transition from identifying as a woman to identifying as non-binary, and that gets to two storylines. The first is the normalization of radical elite cultural leftist norms, the normalization of norms. That's a little redundant, but the mainstreaming of those norms. And the second layer of that is how the media helps people like Demi Lovato mainstream those radical cultural norms. So it is really a serious conversation. And let's kick it off. Kylee, I'll toss to you because you did a little, I think you said you went down a Demi Lovato rabbit hole yesterday.
I did. I really did. Yeah. I'm technically in Demi Lovato's like key demographic as far as audience or people who, were teens when she was doing camp rock and coming out as like, her teen pop star phase. But I was never really a Demi Lovato fan. So I really needed to go back down the Demi Lovato history rabbit trail to get a full grasp on her story and her picture. And of course, I saw the headlines about her overdose and other things, but I didn't know any of the details about that. So I really did a deep dive. And, starting, of course, with the latest news out this week. And you're right about the media helping her do this because several of the headlines, I would say actually probably most of the headlines just ran straight away with Demi Lovato changes their pronouns, comes out as non-binary. I mean, they just adopt it instantly. No questions asked, like adopt her language and just perpetuate that narrative. And
it's AP style.
Yeah, it is. They have said that it's singular pronoun. So that's pretty crazy that they've completely helped Hollywood elites normalize things, mainstream things that are not normal.
Which, by the way, I understand when it comes to like face-to-face interactions with people who are adults and have preferred pronouns. And, you're in a one-on-one conversation or you're in a social setting. I understand that. But for the AP to, again, this is maybe something we can get into later, but like the media has really assisted in the normalization of this cultural leftism, radical cultural leftism, and to an extent that has created a very unhealthy and dangerous situation for young girls. That's why in particular the Demi Lovato case study is an instructive one and a dangerous one. Actually on the table right in front of us, if you're watching this as opposed to just listening, I have Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, who was on the podcast when the book came out last summer and is, I think, a really invaluable writer right now. You should subscribe to her Substack. It's fantastic. It's called The Truth Fairy. But Irreversible Damage was such an important book. It showed how the sort of rapid normalization of cultural leftism and gender ideology, cultural leftist gender ideology, was having an immediate effect and immediate consequences on young girls. And those would be young girls who probably do idolize, or maybe idolize isn't the right word, but do admire Demi Lovato. And even if they don't, Demi Lovato saying that this is how, if this is how Demi Lovato prefers to be identified, and then the media legitimizes that, don't you think that has an effect downstream on people outside the coastal enclaves where that's already gospel?
Well, it absolutely has an effect. And even if you're not somebody who idolizes Demi Lovato or even looks up to her, it's fair to say that, people are even passively following her. I mean, she has 100 million Instagram followers. Is that right? And another, 5.5, it's more than that, millions of followers on Twitter, 15 million on Twitter. I'm not sure. So these are people, even if she's not somebody that you look up to, it's somebody who continues to thrust ideas into people's into the forefront of their mind and just into the mainstream. So that absolutely has an effect. It's also interesting, particularly because you bring up the Schreier book. One of her primary themes, I think, is the way that gender dysphoria, rapid onset gender dysphoria, and how groups of friends will suddenly all kind of come out with this gender dysphoric idea at the same time because of peer pressure and social interactions. And so what's interesting about Demi Lovato is that even if this is not somebody that, say, your daughter is idolizing, when Hollywood elites do this type of thing, they're really also just shining a spotlight on things that are happening at greater rates behind the scenes. Anything that Demi Lovato is coming out and saying that the media is adopting wholesale, you can bet that there are hundreds of TikTok videos, Instagram reels, things that are representing the exact same ideology, that even if your daughter's not following Demi Lovato, chances are she's getting this exact same messaging from all of her channels of engagement.
And let me just read, I think, some statistics from Abigail Schreier's book that put this problem in perspective. Here's one between 2016 and 2017. This is the one when I read the book that really stood out to me. Between 2016 and 2017, the number of gender surgeries for natal females in the US quadrupled, with biological women suddenly accounting for, as we have seen, 70% of all gender surgeries. Now, here's an important aspect of that. Here's an important, I would say, follow-up statistic to that. Several studies indicate that nearly 70% of kids who experience childhood gender dysphoria and are not affirmed or socially transitioned eventually outgrow it. And here's another one. The clear majority of adolescent girls who had discovered transgender identity in adolescence, out of the blue, had done so after a period of prolonged social media immersion. Second, the prevalence of transgender identification within some of the girls' friend groups was more than 70 times the expected rate. Schreier also says that in 2007, there was one gender clinic in the United States. Today, there are well over 50. Planned Parenthood, Kaiser, and Mayo all disperse testosterone. Many do so on a first visit or an informed consent basis. No referral or therapy required. The age of medical consent varies by state. In Oregon, it is 15. Now, this cocktail is, I keep using the word dangerous, and it is dangerous. It's already wreaked consequences on a generation of young girls. And, I thought we were kind of getting to a point where we understood that it was, where you have this cocktail of statistics that show the majority of people who are not transitioned do outgrow it. And statistics that show the people who are being pushed into gender affirmation or hormone treatment, they have really easy access at places like Planned Parenthood. And so you have this situation where the access is so immediate and so easy and is prescribed, literally prescribed as a treatment, but it does cause, as the title of the book suggests, irreversible damage. So there's this really quick, there's this very immediate access to things that can cause irreversible damage. And there has been a very rapid mainstreaming in our culture of those things. Doesn't that kind of make the media's treatment of Demi Lovato's new identity reckless?
Yes, and it also just exposes a lie of gender theory, which is that it's about visibility. It's not about offering visibility to people who are already struggling with gender dysphoria or an identity crisis. It's facilitating it. It's creating a crisis of that. It's not shining a light on it. It's fostering it. It birthed it, basically. There's so much to unpack in those statistics. Absolutely heartbreaking, the number of girls that this is affecting, particularly on the heels of, years of a lot of gains for women and girls. That's really heartbreaking. And also, just as far as Planned Parenthood goes, the fact that that also just exposes the lie of gender theory and just the radical left, because that's not Planned Parenthood's mission. It's really all putting all of their ducks in this one basket of gender theory and just pushing it all the way. And I don't think that we quite have the energy that we need to stop all of that momentum. That's a lot when you have all of Hollywood, when you have the radical left, gender clinics. Doctors prescribing this. That's a lot of energy headed in that direction.
1 to 50. From one gender clinic to 50.
Right. And not to mention the social media influence, which is huge. And also, it's worth noting about social media, just the lack of parent involvement. And I wonder how much that has propelled it. I know that it has, but I wonder to what extent. The sort of hands-off, everyone has a screen parenting approach, because I can't imagine that that's a small contribution. to the problem.
Well, that's an interesting point. I guess, this book was basically deplatformed, and Schreier, Amazon wouldn't let her run ads for this book on their website, and there have been other instances where the book is targeted for removal from various different things, from various different platforms. And we're talking about somebody who's contributed to the Wall Street Journal for a long time. She has a bachelor's of philosophy from Oxford, a JD from Yale. This is not just some scorched earth conservative pundit ranting in a basement. This is a serious piece of scholarship and research, and it is written compassionately. And I'm talking about irreversible damage still. It is written compassionately. And the problem is, if any media outlet would dare to challenge Demi Lovato, as I know we have a piece up on our website, you're sort of dismissed reflexively as a bigot. And that's we sort of have come to this point where we take for granted that the left considers all of this sort of even if it's compassionate and informed and well-researched, any of this opposition to be bigotry. I feel like we take that for granted now because we're so used to it, and we've just sort of grown this thick skin where it barely penetrates at this point.
Right.
But that is part of how this has become so dangerous and how it has happened so quickly, because you don't want to, the incentive to speak up is so low. The disincentive is so intense.
Right.
And that's how you go from having one gender clinic to 50 gender clinics in short order. And you have this quadrupling between 2016 and 2017. That's incredible. And it's not just a problem when it comes to this issue.
Right.
It's a problem when it comes to issues across the sort of political landscape. And I just don't know at this point, when you have so many examples of just the immediate tragic consequences, I don't know at this point what to do.
Well, it feels also that we've kind of exhausted the debate over gender and sex and over words. We're not even just fighting over the culture or over what is normal. We can't even agree on a language or on, biological realities. And we can argue about them until we're blue in the face, and we can publish think piece after think piece that, walks through the plain science of this is biology and this is what words mean. And we can't even agree on that. We're not even operating in the same framework of reality. And so how do you fight a battle when you can't define your terms? How do you fight a battle when you can't even agree that, them there is a plural pronoun? That kind of leaves you without the language and therefore without the resources to have an effective, we're way past effective conversation. Dialogue can't happen when you don't have a shared language and concept of reality. And so at this point, we're battling over such a basic question, and that is what is real and what is made up, and we can't agree on that. But the argument really goes all the way back to there. It doesn't start with kids in the classroom, asserting that they are this gender or that gender. It doesn't start with, on the campus professorial level where they're, where you're putting your pronouns on a name tag. This starts literally with language, and we can't agree on it.
Yeah, that's an important element of all of this, sort of how, you have to sort of talk about postmodernism when you talk about all of this, because this sort of silly, cliched phrase now that people are living their truths, my truth, everyone has an individual truth, is something we also see celebrities and entertainment media spread and normalize. I don't know why that seems to have caught on with this section of the American public. Maybe it's the we're millennials. Maybe it's the sort of everyone gets a trophy mentality that everyone is special and everybody has their own truth. And it sort of individualizes and makes you feel unique. Maybe that's what it is. But, you have to talk about this. You have to talk about that. You have to talk about that in this context, and that when you destroy and attack the fundamental concept of truth, your ability to have consensus it disintegrates, and then the consensus itself disintegrates, and then you're left with this totally siloed and fragmented society, which is, I kind of think, what it feels like, and maybe we only feel it in media circles, maybe it's not felt as acutely in other parts of the country where people live normal lives and don't have to pay attention to all this nonsense. Right. We didn't even define what gender dysphoria or non-binary identification means, because obviously, like, we have to do this in our work. We run across it in our work, but for a lot of people, they probably have, like, thankfully, they have no idea what it means, right? Because it is really radical. But
just because it's something that they might not know how to define, or that it's not something that they are necessarily aware of happening, to their own, sanity. Like, that's a good thing, I guess, to some degree, if you can unplug from this insane, detached from reality world that media and Twitter personalities and whatever live in. But that doesn't mean, as we saw just this week with that school in Wisconsin, that it's not still happening in your small town, even if you're not aware of it. It could still be affecting your kids very acutely, even if you don't. Even if you can't define the term gender dysphoria.
Well, let's jump into that example, because these two things happened in the same span of like 24 hours. First, you had the news of Demi Lovato changing her identification. And then Kylee and I are both from Wisconsin. Something hit my inbox from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and they're working with Alliance Defending Freedom, two great groups. And they've documented this case that really hit close to home for me because it happened at my high school. I went to the school district from, the age of 5 to the age of 18. My brother went there. It's in that high school is in a town of 2,500 people, a pretty rural town of 2,500 people in a very conservative county in Wisconsin. And there was a girl, gets to irreversible damage. It gets to Demi Lovato. There was a girl at that school who was struggling with gender dysphoria. Her parents requested that the school not, and this is according to Will, by the way, the parents requested the school not affirm through pronouns and through their general treatment of their daughter, that new gender identification, the girl identifying as a boy. The parents requested the school not do that. The school said no. The school affirmed the new gender identity against the parents' wishes. This is a public school. And what happened is this girl ends up going to a gender affirmation therapy, like formal gender affirmation therapy, and eventually says that gender affirmation therapy really messed me up. The quote is, really messed me up. And that girl now identifies once again as a girl, according to the notice that was sent yesterday by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. That is really, it shows, again, the kind of very immediate consequences that the corporate media's waxing poetic or waxing sanctimonious about all of these so-called human rights issues and just attempting to force this down the rest of the country's throat and forcing this ideological monopoly, enforcing it in their own ranks. That is having serious consequences on the rest of the country. And in this case, the consequence is clearly this young girl getting, quote, really messed up.
Right. Well, and for every child like this girl, there are other casualties of parents not being able to regain control over the manipulation that schools have over their children, which, total sidebar, but this is why we need school choice, so that parents have the option to take their kids out of government schools that refuse to abide by parents' wishes, and instead are willing to completely foster gender lies.
See, here's Kylie schooling me on language, by the way. Speaking of the importance of language, I said public school. Kylie just went pedal to the metal with government school.
Government school. These are government schools. They are not serving the interests of the public. Yeah, so that's why we need school choice, by the way, for instances like this. But just, this highlights one instance where, thank goodness the parents were able to reclaim the ground here, see what was happening, and help their child, re-identify as the sex that she is.
And imagine if hormones had been administered.
Oh,
imagine if this girl had walked into a Planned Parenthood.
Right.
or a Mayo Clinic, whatever, and gotten hormones. I mean, that is very difficult to reverse. I mean, if impossible in some cases.
Right. But so, this isn't an isolated instance of one school randomly. I mean, this is one school in rural Wisconsin. And if this is happening there, we know that this is happening around the country, and not all parents are so fortunate to be able to get, lawsuits, get the ball rolling with lawsuits, or be able to pull their children out of school. Again, if you don't have a school choice option, or if you can't afford to remove your child from school, like it's just you against the school, and your kids are just at the mercy of leftist rhetoric.
Yeah.
And are forced to, navigate that as it's also being reinforced from celebrities like Demi Lovato, from apps like TikTok, from all their social media intake. I mean, I don't really know how parents are supposed to navigate that. They got lucky in this instance. That's not the norm.
Yeah. And, again, something that I should say about this high school and school district is, I don't know if it's best described as rural or suburban. It's about 45, maybe a little bit more minutes outside of Milwaukee, kind of like right on the outskirts of the suburbs, if not just a little past it. But it is it definitely has kids that come from suburban backgrounds that go there, but it is a very, very conservative area. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the bottom line here. Waukesha County is one of the most conservative counties in the country, or at least historically has been. And I don't know if the school was afraid of legal retribution. I don't know if the school wanted to honor the parents' requests, but was genuinely sort of in an impossible place because of the regulations that exist and the threat of legal challenges if they hadn't. That's possible. But it's also, possible that the people graduating from our education programs at colleges around the country are being taught to enforce these cultural leftist norms on children. I've heard from people who are in education programs about, prominent ones, about how far left the curriculum that they're learning to pass on to inject into curriculums around the country is. So there's an element of that going on here as well. But it just drives me crazy, and what made this, I think, hit particularly close to home for me, is that there are, what's essentially happened is that the educated elites who have migrated from the classrooms of academia into the boardrooms and newsrooms of the corporate world and the media world have taken this cultural leftist ideology that a slice of the population, a relatively small slice of the population, agrees with, and said that, the rest of the country needs to adhere to it, lest they be stigmatized, lest they, people in this corner of Waukesha County in Wisconsin lose their reputations in their neighborhood or on the PTA, or lose their jobs, or at least be scared of losing their jobs. And this is another way, I think, that elites are just trying to silence everybody else. They're enhancing their own power with these identity politics, which some of them use cynically as a shield, and some of them really genuinely believe in, to the point where they're blind to so many different things. And what happens is the rest of the country gets screwed, because the rest of the country has more reason to shut up.
Right. Because you talked about the bigot smear being thrown around. That's a really big charge. And now we use, it's in every other headline. Like, yeah. I mean, it's used as a smear all the time. And so it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's also just interesting to see the lack of grace in this whole worldview, where you must subscribe to it or you are a bigot, because of something we talked about earlier, which is the fact that this is the result of postmodernism. This is the end result of that. And it's really an interesting exercise to reflect on how you go from my truth to if you dissent, you're wrong. Like, right. It's a really weird. You kind of lose your sanity like a little bit into thinking about it, because it's just kind of like, how do we go from this like entire dissent from the idea that there is a universal truth to full circle now, like relativism is a universal truth, and if you disagree with it, like, you are a bigot. You're just a bigot.
The relativity is absolute.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make any sense. It's paradoxical.
No sense.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting too. So just to come back to like the Demi Lovato deep dive into her whole history, it's funny to see her latest news in light of her life leading up to this, because she just released a docuseries before she came out as non-binary, tracking kind of her life through her overdose and her, you know, her drug and alcohol addiction, through her evolution from teen star to, you know, adult actress, pop star, whatever.
It's really sad stuff. I mean,
it's very sad.
Tragic life.
It's very sad, but the terms that she talks about it in, I mean, here she's come out as non-binary, which is a completely amorphous, fluid, relative thing. Like the whole idea of it is that it's not defined. You can't pinpoint it. It's not like one truth. It is just they, them, non-binary. Like
but the one truth is the spectrum, right? The one truth is that gender exists on the spectrum,
right? And the way that she talks about it is in this documentary is like it's a spiritual journey. Her journey to get here was very spiritual. It was about discovering herself. But like all of the steps that she took before coming out as non-binary were also steps to discover her truth and find herself and to kind of come into herself. I mean, you know, her like having her whole eating disorder was like kind of her attempt to like identify herself how she wanted to identify herself. And then it was like she had this whole like drug alcohol problem, and it was like, you know, people are trying to make me be this, but I need to find my truth and I'm doing this. And then she almost died, and then she comes back and now she's on this spiritual journey. They scrapped an entire documentary that they had made in order to make this new one about her drug overdose, because again, like her path from sobriety to almost overdosing to then like, you know, coming back from that was again once again her trying to rediscover her identity and like become her true self. And it's like that's just kind of the pattern of the whole leftist relativist narrative where it's all self-destructive and it's all sort of a spiritual realm that's detached from reality, and you come out with this very ill-defined idea of who you are and what truth is, but it's absolute. And like just watching her trajectory through that is really interesting, because this is only one self-discovery of many that have fallen apart. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, it's also, again, we're talking about an artist, and Hollywood is an industry allegedly of artists. And it gets to all of the sort of strange contradictions of today's left, which is, you know, the sort of like, I think it gets at this ultimate incoherence. And that, again, gets to postmodernism. This is when you're sort of untethered from a belief in certain absolute truths. And when you are sort of deliberately untethered from a coherent worldview, because you do believe things are all relative, it's sort of impossible to come to coherence. And that's why we have this like rampant contradictions that, by the way, fuel a lot of tension and division in this country, because normal people see those, right? Like artists should be welcoming sort of like free speech, and, you know, they should be welcoming Madeline, our colleague Madeline Osborne, and I had a story a couple weeks ago about Harry Styles and his subversion, very intentional subversion of gender norms when it comes to fashion.
Sure.
Harry Styles sort of intentionally wears dresses and skirts. And, you know, if you think about like David Bowie, that was intentionally transgressive. There was no like real motivation to mainstream it, because when you mainstream the transgressive, it loses its value of transgression. And there's something, you know, really important to artists about being transgressive and challenging people's worldviews. But you're not challenging anybody's worldview if you're actually advocating for that challenge to become, what's the word I'm looking for? Just irrelevant, right? Like because it's mainstream.
Right.
So that's one of the contradictions, right? That all of these artists on the left don't really want free thought. You know, they're all trapped in groupthink. But another one is being pro-woman and then having these ideas that are so harmful to women,
right?
And insisting on them being the truth. And you got an important contradiction earlier about everything being relative, but that relativity being absolute.
It is.
It's sort of like, yeah, it's a puzzle that's difficult to solve, but it's
its own orthodoxy. I mean, there are very, very clear lines in the sand that you don't cross that are like, this is sinning against relativism, which is a really interesting paradox.
Yeah. And Demi Lovato, we should have actually prefaced the conversation with this. She is clearly still struggling. Like,
yes,
this is all part of like a very personal narrative of tragedy when it comes to Demi Lovato, who recently had this bizarre rant about frozen yogurt and diet culture. Did you encounter that on your rabbit hole?
Not really, because I went really far back. So I know she had a whole meltdown about fat-free frozen yogurt or something, but I don't really know exactly what happened with that. But did it have to do with her whole eating disorder thing?
Yeah. Okay. She was upset, I think, that a frozen yogurt shop was embracing diet culture, something to that extent. I don't know the specifics, but
Hasn't that always kind of been the point of frozen yogurt?
But I do know there was something very disturbing about her public-facing comments and conduct. She does seem to be unwell, and that's perfectly fine. And this is the question I was going to ask you next. Like, we think about this a lot in the context of Britney Spears. I wrote a piece about Britney Spears a few months back when the most recent Hulu documentary from the New York Times caused a stir, not just in the media, but I think with a lot of people. I was looking back at pictures of her, and in one of those paparazzi shots, she's wearing a shirt that says, the American dream, something to that effect, basically arguing that here she is, this sort of American dream incarnate. And to see how celebrities who we used to think of as embodying the American dream coming from small rural towns in Louisiana, somebody like Demi Lovato, I don't know her background very well. You may know her background. Just being sort of torn apart by fame and the very American concept of fame. I guess I'm curious for your take on what that says. I mean, we're talking about the media right now in a very negative context about its sort of like ideological monopoly and its, the progressive or bigot binary insistence. But is there also something when it comes to Demi Lovato in terms of the media either enabling, mental illness or causing mental illness in celebrities in a way that makes sort of success in America, the more successful you are, the more likely you are to be canceled, suddenly very unappealing?
That's an interesting question because that's not a new problem.
Right. Judy Garland.
Right. So, I mean, there have been... for as long as celebrities have been celebrities, they've been forever in the public eye, and there are always controversies about them. If it's not about cancel culture, it's about other decisions that they make. So cancel culture adds a new element because you have to be so careful about, the things you say and do. But I don't think, cancel culture is what drove Demi Lovato to be, kind of mad, to be sort of that's just true. Disturbed. As somebody who comes out as non-binary, like, I don't think she's doing that in order not to be canceled. Like, I don't think that's a concern of hers. I think her interactions with the media, with celebrity, with the press has much more to do with her body image, with, other things that celebrities have traditionally struggled with as far as mental illness and other paparazzi issues go. So that's an interesting question, but it's, the problem of celebrity and of media exposure is not unique to this moment. Right. Despite the new challenges that we have with social media and how fast news travels, I suppose. But even still, paparazzi is not new.
So relative to Britney Spears, Demi Lovato is still fairly new to fame. When she, it was like, it's been, a little bit over a decade, I would say, since Demi Lovato like really got famous. Yeah. She comes from the Disney Channel, and Britney Spears was a Mouseketeer. We have all these examples of former Disney people who, take the Miley Cyrus path and et cetera. It's just an interesting point that you just made about how you don't think cancel culture is what wrecked Demi Lovato, and I agree with that. But it's kind of interesting because when you think about Britney Spears, part of what was so hard for her is the right was very different at the time, and the culture was very different at the time, to the point where she and Justin Timberlake, and this is the same with like Jessica Simpson, had to maintain this reputation for being virgins and for being, sort of the lily white girl next door. And in a way, you can go to like Tipper Gore or whatever. The cultural right at a couple of decades back was very different. And I guess it's just, to me, I always lose this perception. It's something I fail at, but I always try to keep the perspective of like, we take so much for granted now, that like our celebrities are just outwardly so sexualized and just so sexualized, and that our culture is so mean and aggressive. It's like we take it for granted. I would never, by the way, advocate for like the Tipper Gore approach to culture. I think that's wrong, and I think it stifles art in the same way that cancel culture on the left right now stifles art. But it's just, we do take for granted how quickly things have changed, and I do wonder if that's something that has been painful for Demi Lovato, who really is in the influencer age and came up when people were under these new social media microscopes in a way that hadn't happened with, say, Judy Garland, who was under a microscope, but it wasn't quite the same as social media era.
Because that wasn't so secularized in the way that that's the culture that Demi Lovato has had to rise to fame in. That's an interesting question. I think it's so pertinent to Demi Lovato's struggles as her body image and her like eating disorder issues. I mean, that's really central to kind of like her initial falling apart, which I think definitely has to do with the sexualization of young women, the attention that you get as a young female celebrity. She was in beauty pageants and such, which is just like a recipe for disaster when you go from that world to being people are hyper focused on you as a young child star female.
But there's something very American about beauty pageants.
Very American.
And beauty pageant culture. And there's something, as wonderful as this country is, the greatest country to have ever existed on the face of the earth. The materialism in American culture, 20th century and beyond, is something that we've never really dealt with either, and that the right has never really dealt with either.
No, but also, I mean, in a way, beauty pageants maybe used to be a little bit more confined to beauty pageants, and now it's something that's much more pervasive just because of social media. You're no longer just competing in front of judges in a small group officially in a beauty pageant. Clicks drive popularity and drive your social image. And that all has the same, sort of mental, I can't think of what is the drug, dopamine, that just dopamine, like where you get that sort of hit. So now it's just much more pervasive than it was when it was just confined to like an actual beauty pageant.
Well, let's close.
Now it's now beauty pageants are called Instagram.
Yeah, right. Like it's every day on Instagram.
Yes, it's every single person.
This is why I just post pictures of trees. And they're all beautiful. All of the trees are beautiful.
Yep. No matter the size and shape.
So let's sort of, I feel like we've opened this can of worms and are now like fielding the worms and trying to get them back into the can. Because this is just a super loaded topic. There's so many layers. But this is, I think, particularly relevant. It's another statistic from Irreversible Damage. Among preteen girls aged 10 to 14, rates of self-harm are up 189% since 2010, nearly triple what they were only 6 years before. Since 2010. That's about exactly since the time that Demi Lovato was coming to fame. We're talking about her maturation or attempted maturation in this very new era of social media for not just celebrities, but the entire country. We've seen charts that show literally like 2007 when the iPhone comes out, mental health issues with millennials at the time, just basically tanking, or with youth at the time. Those struggles going up dramatically since the iPhone itself. It was really the dawn of the smartphone era. I wonder how you think Demi Lovato fits into that context, because I think it's important that Schreier talks about it in the book a lot, just sort of how there's an interplay here between the struggles, the mental health struggles that are, increasing, and the increase of struggles with gender dysphoria or perceived gender dysphoria, and then the irreversible damage that goes on to be caused. So what element do you think that has in the Demi Lovato saga?
Are you talking specifically about self-harm or just about...
Has she said she self-harms? I feel like I remember that, but I shouldn't say it unless I know it.
Yeah, that wasn't central to, at least as far as I got into her deep dive. I started watching her documentary and things, and it was mostly, the things that I've been working through in her backstory have been mostly eating disorder related things, and then drug alcohol abuse, which led her to accidentally overdose.
Right.
So I don't know that was the same as like what Schreier was talking about.
She has admitted to self-harm.
Okay.
By the way.
So
yes.
I guess
I shouldn't say admitted. She's opened up about it. It's nothing, you have to admit. It's, a serious thing that a lot of people deal with.
Right. I think, I'm not sure if this answers your question or not, but I think all of the aspects of Demi Lovato's story, including self-harm, including the gender, including her latest announcement, all go back to something that our culture is seriously dealing with now, which is looking for something that you're never going to find.
Standards, impossible standards, and also just like fulfillment in yourself that you can't find. And like, I don't fully understand the impulses that lead to self-harm as someone who's never struggled with that. So I don't want to speak to that, but just like, I mean, Demi Lovato's entire life is like trying to find herself and trying to please other people. And you're never going to find that in yourself. And I think that is the answer to a lot of our cultural questions right now. To the transgender movement, to the reason why there's such an uptick in trans youth is that these kids are, there's a void inherent in every human being, and you're not going to find it in switching your gender. And like, that's a huge problem that we're looking in all the wrong places for answers to self-identity. I think what you're getting
and I think part of that is the decline of religion is kind of what I'm getting at.
No, keep going.
We've discarded religion. We've discarded, actual true spirituality and morality in a lot of ways. And people have tried to replace that with everything from gender ideology to, critical race theory and other just ideas of, intersectionality, where you fit, sort of just like trying to find your place in the world, and whether you find that in substances or whether you find that in an idea that you kind of cling to and view the world through that. That's really trying to take the place of a religion in having this worldview. And I think that's the answer to a lot of these questions, is people trying to fill a void that cannot be filled with these temporal things, temporal things. Yeah,
it's utopian. And when we lose our moral bearings, because we're untethered from the concept of absolute truth and objectivity, you can sort of see how easy it is to fall in this sort of like utopian view of the world. And this is sort of galaxy brain, but we see that also in our sort of like impossible expectations for racial equality, which again, there are horrifying instances of racial discrimination in this country. Absolutely, I don't deny that at all. But to act as though we must have that we can get to a place where humans who are wired to be tribalistic will totally, never struggle with this.
Right.
When this country has shed so much blood, sweat, and tears to get to, I think, probably the most enlightened and harmonious, multicultural, I mean that like in a literal sense of, having so many people of different backgrounds together in one country. And for a time that really did feel harmonious, and maybe does still outside coastal enclaves, we just lose perspective on what a miracle this country is.
Right.
And when we lose that perspective, or this sort of like utopianism, I think is really the source of the loss of that perspective. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and going even a little bit deeper than that or before that, it represents a misunderstanding of what human beings are and what human nature is.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fundamentally, not only is it crazy that, this experiment has worked as well as it has for so long, but also, human beings are not wired to facilitate utopia. We're destructive.
No.
We're destructive beings. We're tribal beings. Thomas Sowell addresses this super well in his book, A Conflict of Visions, about, how just there's these two very fundamental worldviews, one that believes that you can reform things to a sort of level of utopia, and one that kind of sees mankind as a little bit more of a bad actor. And that will totally determine how you think about these things. But if you believe in this utopia idea that is totally impossible, it leads you to sort of fill in very non-religious ideas into this sort of religion void, and racial justice is one of them. This idea that this is possible, and you can create this system that is perfect.
Right. Something that drives
equity is
yes. And something that drives me crazy, and you hear it from people on both the left and the right, just a parting thought here, is when people share stupid inspirational graphics about how, I believe that people are naturally good. No, people are fallen.
Yep.
We are fallen. Right. We are naturally sinners.
Right.
People are not inherently good.
Right.
And I feel like that very silly, trite phrase has kind of been, I feel like people our age have just sort of been conditioned to see the world that way. And the other half of our generation has been conditioned to sort of see people as irredeemably fallen in the woke religion, right? So everyone that doesn't subscribe to their religion is irredeemably fallen. There is no grace. And that's just really uncomfortable situations, or it creates an uncomfortable dynamic in the country.
Yeah, so that also just describes why relativism doesn't work, because human beings are fallen. So the idea that you can find truth in you is wrong. That you need a transcendent truth, or everything's going to go to heck.
Yeah, a higher truth.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Kylie, you're so wise.
Emily, you didn't say that I was so young. That was a shock.
No, you're so wise. I guess I'm also wise. Don't you think?
Yeah.
No.
She made me say it.
Well, we went a little far afield from Demi Lovato, but I think, it's sort of important to pause at these moments. A lot of people probably don't realize exactly how influential Demi Lovato is. I don't think there's a bunch of girls around the country who see Demi Lovato post something to this extent and come out in this way and are suddenly saying, Demi Lovato did it, so it's okay. But it is about the sort of downstream normalization that celebrities have, and entertainment media and media in general has on our culture, and has on sort of normalizing ideas and conduct and behaviors. And I think this case study is an important one. So Kylie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Emily.
You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.